So our first session is all about the importance of an ICJ advisory opinion on Southeast Asian environmental law and local communities. So this session is brought to you by Parabukas, a women-led Asia-based environmental consultancy firm working on legal and policy issues related to climate change, the environment, and sustainable development. Its mission is to bridge the disconnect between law and policy and environment and development, a gap that is particularly sharp in the context of environmental law and domestic practice and implementation. We are also in partnership with the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law, a law institute focused on providing practical solutions to environmental law problems. ARIEl adopts a multidisciplinary approach to solving environmental issues, emphasizing ecologically sound measures and participatory methods. Its mission is to transform the environmental and social governance landscape of the ASEAN region by creating a new paradigm of environmental justice, firmly anchored in environmental rule of law. I am your host today, Sofia Caralde from Parabukas, and I am very excited to be here with you, and of course, our very inspiring and well-rounded panelists. But before we start, I would like to greet every woman in this virtual platform a very happy Women's Month. Today's session takes inspiration from the world's youth who have been passionately campaigning for climate action and human rights to protect the rights of current and future generations from the adverse impacts of climate change. So without further ado, let me call on Attorney Cecilia Therese-Kiao, Parabukas Operations Director and co-founder, to give her opening remarks.
Thank you, Sophia, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this historic time of youth action to bring climate justice to the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ. In the Philippines, at the national level, the Commission on Human Rights has finally released the report on its landmark national inquiry on climate change. The CHR found legal grounds to hold fossil fuel companies, or the carbon majors, accountable for all acts to obfuscate climate science to the prejudice of the right of the public to make informed decisions and ultimately delayed meaningful environmental climate action. This landmark petition was the second attempt to frame climate change as a human rights issue and the first to be accepted by a national human rights institution for investigation. This is a clear manifestation and a definitive finding of the link between the climate crisis and human rights. In the Southeast Asian region, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, has begun its preparations for a regional environmental rights framework that could possibly be adopted by 2024. Now, in the international arena, the world's youths are bringing the issues of climate change and human rights to the ICJ, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. While the ICJ has no binding authority, one of its main functions is to provide legal advice through advisory opinions, which could have a persuasive effect on courts at all levels. Parabukas supports the WYCJ's campaign and believes that an ICJ advisory opinion could bolster the Philippine Commission on Human Rights resolution on the National Inquiry on Climate Change and Human Rights, as well as other initiatives in the Southeast Asian region, to recognize the climate change and human rights nexus and to enforce rights arising from it. We hope that our session can give you a better idea as to the significance of an ICJ advisory opinion to Southeast Asia, and to help us find opportunities to support each other as we move forward in this campaign. Thank you very much, and I wish everyone a pleasant day.
Thank you so much, Attorney Niner, for that wonderful and very insightful opening remarks. So to continue our session and to give us an overview of climate change and human rights in Southeast Asia, please welcome Matthew Baird, the Director of Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law. Hello, Matthew.
Hi, Sophia. Thank you very much. And it's great to be here. And I echo both the early introduction to acknowledge International Women's Day that happened on Wednesday. And also hopefully that Paolo will be able to put in the chat box a link to the Seeds of Justice webcast that ARIEl organized with some amazing women, including from Asia, from Parabukas, on the role of women in environmental law in Southeast Asia. And I echo Attorney Niner's observations and also the introductory observations. This is really quite an extraordinary time. It's a great opportunity. It's where youth voices have come together with country aspirations to produce the resolution that hopefully now with 115 sponsors will go up to the United Nations General Assembly. And yes, it will take a certain bit of time before the International Court of Justice looks at some of those elements within the resolution. But at the same time, as Sir Tony said, one of the extraordinary things about an advisory opinion and why it's relevant is it will help provide opportunities for governments to then look at what they must do or what further steps they must take. But more importantly, one of the things is about the legal consequences for those states who have failed by their acts and emissions or who have caused significant harm to the environment as a result of their activities and contributing to climate change. And I think that issue about loss and damage and a bit about liability is very, very important. So without further ado, I'm wanting just to give a little bit of an overview in terms of the way I'm framing this sort of human rights in the face of climate change within Southeast Asia. And so one of the things that we have to realize, of course, is that climate change is not just the sole risk. We talk about the triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity collapse, as these are the three sort of key elements that are all coming together in what is now coming to be seen very clearly as a major existential challenge for us all. Climate change is this sort of force multiplier for potential adverse environmental and human rights impacts. And so for me, this liability for climate change impacts is going to be the key part of the advisory opinion. Part of the opinion also identifies that the $100 billion, the amount of money that was identified at the Paris Agreement and before that needed to be spent on dealing with the adverse impacts of environmental issues and climate change issue and biodiversity issues, that has not been funded. That money has not been found. We still are able to give billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars to the fossil fuel industry as subsidies, but we can't spend the money on actually protecting the environment and stopping what we know is going to happen with respect to climate change. And we've also seen, and this is some of the great work that has been done by the World Youth for Climate Justice and other organizations, declarations of climate emergencies throughout the world, recognizing that these impacts of climate change are real and are happening now. And this perhaps for me, is this idea that when the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, issued their interim report, that there was likely significant consequences of exceeding this 2.5 degrees Celsius target to, we're not even saying we're going to keep our climate temperature the same, but the temperature is going to increase. But the cause, it's clearly anthropogenic. In other words, humanity is causing this, especially through our addiction to fossil fuels, to coal and to gas. And more importantly, that it was likely that this exceedance over this 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees would be happening. Indeed, now we know that we are likely to go over the Paris Agreement mandated target of 2.5 degrees with major consequences to the environment and to the health of our ecosystems and to ourselves. And this is from The Economist, which is a conservative economics magazine that focuses on economic practice. But it talked about no safe place, the 3 degrees future. And this was, looking at the date, from July 2021. And so this report from the IPCC, which is the scientists coming together with the policymakers, identified where there were increase in hot extremes, the most significant extremes of temperature. And we can see from this chart since 1950, almost every single area, including Southeast Asia and East Asia, is predicted to increase with a high degree of confidence. But in addition to this high increase in extreme weather events is also the increase in heavy precipitation, heavy rain events. And that leads to this dreadful bringing together of both increased floods, but also increased droughts and increased extreme heat events, all of which, especially in our region that we know of, will cause more and more significant environmental particular impacts. But within ASEAN, we are in a really interesting situation as to what we can do going forward, using some of the language, some of the methods, some of the ideas behind this advisory opinion. The ASEAN Charter includes a requirement that one of its purposes is to promote sustainable development so as to protect the region's environment, the sustainability of its natural resources, and the high quality of life for its people. In addition, we also have the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration that has celebrated its 10th anniversary last year in Cambodia. And within Article 5, that it was restated by the heads of government of ASEAN, that every person has the right to an effective remedy to be determined by a court or other competent authority for acts violating the rights guaranteed to that person by the constitutional law. And that's important because that's also a national right, not just the right that states have to go before the International Court of Justice, but the idea that we should be able to do these at national levels. And I think, as was mentioned, the idea that the Philippines Human Rights Commission has identified some of the issues that the carbon majors have caused and the liabilities may also give us the opportunity of using this Human Rights Declaration to take action against some of those polluters in national courts. The other important thing in ASEAN is that the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, well before the UN resolution, the General Assembly resolution, recognized the right to a safe, clean and sustainable environment. In Article 28F, there was a right under the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration for every person to an adequate standard of living for himself and herself and his or her family, including the right to a safe, clean and sustainable environment. So within ASEAN, we really do have this recognition that there was, and it has been in existence now for 10 years, the right to a safe, clean and sustainable environment. And as we can also see over the last number of years, especially in the last few years, we've seen some really important events and documents come out where youth voices are finally being heard in ASEAN. 2 years ago, we had the children's rights to a safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment in the ASEAN region, which had principles and policy guidance. In addition, the UN ESCAP has been, and other organizations have been supporting climate justice for children, youth and future generations. The idea that youth voices are now finally being heard by decision makers. And that I think is a really important opportunity for us in ASEAN to keep lobbying governments and the UN and other national bodies on the importance of ensuring that youth voices, children's voices are heard and acted upon and part within the decision-making process. So I just quickly wanted to sort of outline some of those key issues about human rights and climate change. And one of the things is that we have to remember that the obligations are of states for human rights compliance. It's one of those things that even with the development of the business human rights guidance and many other, the framework on human rights and the environment, they all identify the obligation of states for human rights compliance. Now, I'm an environmental lawyer and I love suing corporates. I love also suing governments to ensure environmental law legal compliance, because often there are clear requirements under environmental law that could perhaps be used to introduce some human rights issues in those legal challenges. We also have to then identify how we can develop the liability for corporations who emit greenhouse gases and contribute to the impacts of climate change. And I think this is where the ICJ opinion, advisory opinion, looking at that question of liability is very important, although it relates to states. And one of the things that the Philippines National Human Rights Commission, which is then being talked about in other human rights commissions within the ASEAN region, is the idea of the liability of corporations, maybe not on an individual basis, but certainly as part of a class action about those who are continuing to emit greenhouse gas emissions. In South Asia, I've mentioned that we will see increasing impacts of flooding as well as a significant extreme heat event. The consequence of that are things that we already see: storm events, typhoons, the loss of food security, but more importantly, this increasing challenge to resource allocations. An issue about disaster risk management that is going to be more and more relevant as these disasters and natural disasters become more prevalent, but also the impacts increase. In addition, we are seeing now with ocean acidification and still the ongoing development of our coast and coastal zone, we're seeing loss of coral reefs, seagrasses, mangroves, and fishing stocks. All of these are impacting on the ideas of oceans equity, the need for our billion people who rely on around the world, who rely on the sea for their livelihood. And within Southeast Asia in particular, and within certainly many of the islands in Indonesia and the Philippines, we are going to see a significant challenge to those sustainable livelihoods. We also see the dangerous impacts for Indigenous people protecting lands and biodiversity. We see in countries like Thailand, when national parks are being challenged because of encroachment, and that forest dwellers who have protected those lands and protected the biodiversity are seen as being those that need to be removed. So this is a real challenge for Indigenous peoples who have protected the land and who have made sure that those areas are still functioning with their biodiversity intact, while other areas outside their lands have been destroyed for profit. These are going to be dangerous times for Indigenous people because there are still people who want to despoil the environment for profit. We also see a growing challenges for environmental and human rights defenders, not only in Southeast Asia, but also in the Pacific. Those people who are trying to protect their communities, their subsistence, their environment, are now being targeted even more by those seeking to exploit and destroy. So one of the things we need to do is to make those human rights obligations binding on the corporate sector. And I think we can use environmental law breaches to raise these human rights impacts. Once there's been a breach of a license, either for an environmental impact assessment or a development or pollution, then we can raise the human rights impacts. For example, the impact on air pollution that prevents people from access to right to health or being able to go to education. But more importantly, if there are issues that are done that take away people's, affect people's livelihoods and securities, fishing stocks and others, these can also be raised in environmental law cases, of which there are many great environmental lawyers in the Philippines, to raise those human rights impacts as a consequence of those environmental law breaches. Tragically, countries, and I refer to Australia, but also Indonesia and other countries, are still funding coal and gas developments for energy. And this is something that will need to stop. The transition has to be advanced. And that's also not only because of climate change impacts, but because of the extraordinary consequences of air pollution. And we're seeing that massive air pollution impacts throughout Southeast Asia. Now that COVID is sort of receding in some ways, we're now realizing that the air pollution issues are one of the most significant human rights issues that we are facing now. And finally, that idea about liability and payments for adaptation and mitigation payments for natural disasters need to be by polluters and countries that have supported and promoted fossil fuels, and that will need to be clarified. Certainly this ICJ opinion is that first step to clarify the obligations of the states, but those ideas that companies, the private sector that has profited, and governments that have failed to act since, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, for example, in 1992, and respond to that, are those countries and those companies that should be held liable for damages and for payments to fund natural disaster rehabilitation and response, and to fund adaptation for communities. And so one of the things that I also wanted to share with you today is something that is quite exciting within the ASEAN region. And that is that the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights has been leading the dialogue since 2014 on human rights and the environment. And it convened a meeting in 2014 on human rights and climate change and the impact of climate change on human rights. And that has led to a number of discussions and raising the idea that human rights and climate change are intertwined. But we can now see that over those last 9 years, those issues of biodiversity collapse and pollution, air pollution in particular, but water pollution as well, and waste management like plastic pollution, have all identified that these are huge environmental consequences that have significant human rights implications. So one of the things that the Asian Research Institute has been working with AICHA over a number of years, and now working with UN Environment Programme and UN ESCAP, UNICEF and UN Human Rights, is working on the idea of this Framework Declaration on Environmental Rights. And just last week, at the 36th meeting of the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission of Human Rights in Indonesia, the AICHA Commission endorsed the formation of the terms of reference and the working group to start the process of consultation on a framework declaration on environmental rights for ASEAN. A number of reports have been written. So looking at things that have happened in the Escazú Agreement, for example, in Latin America and the Caribbean, and earlier on in 1992, 30 years ago, the Aarhus Declaration of the Economic Commission for Europe. And these are some of the key elements that we'll be looking at, and this will be part of an extensive period of discussion and debate. In the Philippines, I understand the Human Rights Commission has already convened an initial working group. I was addressing in Thailand, the Thai Human Rights Commission with the framework body on environmental NGOs on lessons that could be learned from Latin America and the Caribbean, the Escazú Agreement, and the Aarhus Convention for ASEAN, which obviously needs to be an ASEAN type of framework that has to be in accord with the ASEAN way. And there are a number of issues, one of which are the procedural, access to justice, access to environmental information, public participation, free, prior, informed consent for Indigenous, special attention to women, children, and vulnerable groups, and key supporting rights for environmental and human rights defenders. But one of the other things is the idea of picking up on this ASEAN Human Rights Declaration to look at substantive rights in terms of the safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, supporting environmental law principles of the precautionary principle, the polluter pays principle, supporting and enhancing environmental impact assessment, which is a huge issue within the region, but also protecting the environment, including biodiversity, terrestrial ecosystems, oceans, and fisheries. So we know we have the emergency, we know we need to act. There are so many people who come together to ensure that our actions can lead to lasting change. And one of the things that I would like to leave us on when considering, the environment, human rights, climate change issues, reflecting on that the opportunity to develop a framework agreement on the environment over the next 2 years is, what do we want to do, and what do we want to ask our friends and colleagues and associates? Do we want business as usual? Well, unsustainable, unethical, and ecological collapse. Do we want to try harder? Well, is that more of the same? Is there going to be any real change? Is it really just insufficient? Or is it time, as our youth have been telling us, that enough is enough? that we have to be ambitious. We have to regain our compassion for humanity and the environment, and we have to focus on our ecological renewal. It's no longer business as usual. It's no longer to just try harder. We now have to say, enough is enough. Our future is ours. Let us now take control of that future. It's a great opportunity to be here. I thank all the organisers. I thank the youth for making sure that soon the General Assembly will be having to decide on its advisory opinion and the recommendation from Vanuatu and the 115 governments. Thank you very much indeed, and good luck for the rest of the symposium.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And I like what you said, that it's the youth's voices are finally getting heard at the international arena. And I like what you said about how different countries here in ASEAN are doing something to address climate change, or to at least link climate change and human rights. And as we can see in ASEAN declarations, there is a substantial amount of basis that could amount to this. And it's just, I think it's more of a push to everyone to lobby and to continue making our demands known to this national institution, because we have the basis already. It's just we need to work more on these issues. And thank you so much, Matthew, for that very informative talk. And I know my fellow law students here on our Zoom call is also interested in how litigation is working with regards to environmental law, and considering a lot of forums of law, considering that carbon majors are not usually residing in one state. And then we are also talking about enforcing state obligations and making them accountable for their failure to act on climate change, and even if they have contributed to worsening impacts of climate change. So thank you for that, Matthew. And so allow me, excuse me. Okay, allow me to introduce our esteemed speakers now for our panel discussion. I will be introducing all of them now to ensure that the discussion flows smoothly. So let me call on Attorney Asia Wee. Asia is a young lawyer and a legal fellow of Environmental Legal Assistance Center in Palawan. So ELAC help communities defend the earth through legal empowerment and strategic litigation. Asia is also a member of the Asia Pacific Youth Advisory Group on Environmental and Climate Justice. The Youth Advisory Group aims to unite the experienced and dedicated young people working on environmental and climate justice in Asia Pacific region. They work towards strengthening the environmental rule of law by promoting the work of environmental defenders and climate activists through greater protection, visibility, and legal empowerment. Let us all welcome Asia Wee. Hello, Asia. Next is Mr. Ramon San Pascual. So Sir Mon is the Executive Director of Healthcare Without Harm, Asia, an international NGO that seeks to transform healthcare worldwide so that it reduces its environmental footprint, becomes a community anchor for sustainability, and leader in the global movement for environmental health and justice. Having worked with an extensive network of parliamentarians, health professionals, and community and civil society leaders, Sir Mon has helped form and strengthen coalitions of advocates upholding health and social justice in the Philippines and across Asia and Pacific region. Hello, Sir Mon. Next up is Ms. Marleya Muñez. So Ms. Marleya is an independent nonprofit organizational management professional, facilitator and trainer on gender and human rights, climate change, and forestry. Ms. Marleya was appointed as a director and executive director at the Department of Environment and Natural Resources here in the Philippines, as well as the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples. And she had the opportunity to work with environmental science for social change. She also works with several NGOs as a volunteer and technical service provider. Ms. Marleya is a member of the Women's Initiative for Society, Culture, and the Environment, otherwise known as WISE. She is currently working on Web Info Act, which aims to capacitate Indigenous women leaders of communities with rich natural resources. Hello, Ms. Marleya. Lastly, on the list, we have Dr. Antonio Lavinia. So Dr. Lavinia is a leader, teacher, thinker, lawyer, and a social entrepreneur. He is currently the executive director of Manila Observatory and a professor of law, philosophy, political science, and governance at several universities here in the Philippines, including the Ateneo Loyola Schools and Ateneo Law School. He has been a human rights and environmental justice lawyer for 30 years, starting his law career as an advocate for indigenous peoples and local communities, fighting development aggression by logging and mining companies, and in some cases by government, pursuing environmentally destructive projects. He has also been a senior environmental government official, formerly a lead negotiator of the Philippines on climate change and biodiversity conventions. He has worked on environment, development, and governance for several domestic and international organizations. Please welcome Dr. Lavina. Hello, Dean Tony. And then I would also like to introduce to you Ms. Patricia Nicdao from Parabukas, who will be moderating our panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Sophia, for introducing our esteemed panelists. Once again, to the audience, I'm Pat Nicdao, and I'll be facilitating the discussion this afternoon, of course, with the panelists. It's truly an experience to be with inspiring and passionate advocates, and of course, to be able to hear their insights on important campaigns for the current and future generations. I'm sure everyone's excited to hear from our panelists, so I will move on with the discussion. First, to Attorney Asia. May we have Asia here on the spotlight? All right. Hi, Asia. We learned that you had been one of the active volunteers during the early days of this campaign to seek an advisory opinion from the ICJ on climate change and human rights. So, what moved you to support this campaign? How long have you been involved in this campaign? And what are the unique strengths in the youth that enable them to lead this campaign?
Okay. Thank you so much, Pat. So yeah, I am Asia from Asia. So I was involved in around 2018, 2019. So I got in touch with Nicole and Sir Tony that time. I was a law student back then. So at that time, I was thinking, before I met them, I was thinking of climate change as in the perspective of a traveler. So I was thinking, oh no, if climate change, the effects of climate change happens, what will happen to the reefs that I go to when I snorkel? What will happen to the nice beaches and islands that I go to camp, or the mountains that I camp? So it was like that. And then I got in touch with Nicole and Sir Tony that time. And then I got more into the legal aspect and the global the gravity of it globally. So I just wanted to know more. So when there's an opportunity, I volunteer. Whenever there are gatherings, I try my best to attend. And then at one point they said they want to go to New York for a legal mischief. And I was like, okay, what legal mischief? But it's gonna be a nice trip for sure. So I said, okay, I wanna join. I wanna meet other young people who are in this fight. And then when I got the experience there was super nice. So I got to meet a lot of familiar faces here. David, Aline, and the others I saw earlier. And then so locally we are also trying to organize I Am Climate Justice. So it's a more Philippine youth initiative for local mobilizations on the ground. And then at that time, since I was super involved, I noticed that us young people, we have so much energy. So it's the energy can finish a lot of things in a short amount of time, for as long as we're very interested and into it. So I think that's very important and unique about young people, because the energy is with us, and we also have a lot of time. I remember when I joined them in New York, I was a law student then. So I was more than willing to skip 1 month of law school to join this very interesting campaign. Yeah, but for all the law students out there, don't, it's not very advisable. Yeah.
So Asia, what do you think are the unique strengths of the youth aside from having a lot of energy and passion to enabled you guys to lead this campaign?
Yeah. Aside from that, I think our generation now, with the presence of the internet, with our access to information, although not 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 everyone, but a lot, especially in the middle class, um, we we are able to educate ourselves for as long as we're interested, and then partnered with that energy and time, we are able to reach or do a lot of things and approach things very creatively. So the old formulas doesn't apply anymore because we are able to think of new ways to approach problems, and it's just very fresh and fun. uh yeah, I think it's very important that the youth energy is like fun and not very depressing.
That's very inspiring that you have been active in this ever since you were in law school. And we all know how difficult the law school journey is. And of course, guided by many environmental mentors here in the Philippines. Indeed, ang mga kabataan or young people are full of energy, are innovative, and very passionate about these social issues. So as a young environmental lawyer, for you, what is the importance of an ICJ advisory opinion on climate change and human rights to the communities that you work with?
Okay. At first glance, when I was initially asked to answer this question, I thought the advisory opinion is so up there, while local communities are like, it's so far from them. It's not within arm's reach, to put it simply. However, I think it will be relevant, especially if we do our part, no, of doing our part in working with local communities, empowering them, and then finding ways on how this instrument can be used as a tool to fight for their rights, to seek for accountability, to make their governments serve their interests in relation to the climate crisis right now. So I guess for those who are law students here specifically, probably that will be my challenge to you when you pass the bar eventually. That yes, climate change is very important. International negotiations are very important, but I think it's also like equally important to touch bases with those on the ground, because it is their lives who are the most at stake. It's their livelihood, it's their security to water, to food. There's so many things at stake. And I think after the international exposure at that time, I was led to that reflection that there was so much youth energy for climate change internationally and also in the schools. But then how about the local communities who are actually affected by the impacts of climate change? Who is there to walk with them, to make use of the available tools right now legally for them to assert their rights. And it is in this part that the advisory opinion would be nice, because it's going to be an additional tool. Like, for example, if there's another coal plant somewhere that's going to open up, it opens, it's another tool for a lot of things like climate litigation, and then building your arguments. I'm sorry, I'm too fast. Oh,
Go on, Asia.
oh yeah. And okay, Sophie is asking me to shout out to Ateneo Law. There.
All right, all right. So I totally agree. It's true that the term ICJ advisory opinion and even international negotiations can be daunting at first, especially for people without legal background. Even the issue of climate change and environmental justice can be daunting at first sight, but these discussions and negotiations are very crucial for people, especially the youth worldwide. So thank you so much, Asia, for sharing your experience and story to everyone in this Zoom webinar. We will go back to you later in the open forum. I'm sure the audience have so many questions about your experience joining in these international negotiations. Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Asia.
Pat.
Next, we have Sir Mon from Healthcare Without Harm.
Hello. Hi, Pat. Good to see you again.
It's good to see you again, Sir Mon. It's been so long.
Yeah.
So Sir Mon, you've worked extensively with parliamentarians here in the Philippines and of course worldwide, healthcare professionals and local communities on climate change and social justice. So what are some examples of climate change interconnectedness, or what they call nexus, and human rights, particularly to our right to health?
Yeah, and let me focus on health as that's where we are working on. In 2015, it was said that the crisis on climate is also a crisis of public health. And therefore, if we consider the worsening climate condition as a human rights violation in itself, and what therefore is being violated in terms of health. So let me reiterate that health is a fundamental human right, indispensable for the exercise of other human rights. Every human being, each of us, is entitled to enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health conducive to living in a life of dignity. When we fought for reproductive health law in the Philippines across more than a decade of the struggle, we had to bring out to light that reproductive health is an essential reproductive right, particularly among women. That is the right to choose, the right to decide on their bodies. But now that I'm into healthcare without harm, working in the Southeast Asia, we view health now in a broader light and how it is related to climate change and how it becomes a human right issue as well. Now, what is an example of rights to health? It includes access to adequate healthcare facilities and services, and therefore it is also a measure of equity. And it also relates to the social determinants of health, which includes access to food, water and sanitation, safe and health working condition, housing, and that being free from poverty. Now, in healthcare without harm, we believe that the healthcare sector has an important role to play in all of this. Come to think of this, in as much as the healing mission of healthcare professionals is a duty that for which they took their oath, and yet the healthcare sector in itself is responsible for a carbon footprint equivalent to 4.4% of the global net emissions. That is such that if it is a country, the healthcare sector in itself is the fifth largest emitter on the planet. So that provides a very profound contradiction. Whereas you provide healing, but you also do harm. And this is, we take the full responsibility in healthcare without harm over this fact when we came out with that research in 2019, the carbon footprint of healthcare. And then the following 2 years in 2021, we released the how to journey towards low carbon healthcare, Now, we are convinced that it is only through the power of collective action that we will achieve change. And therefore, we work across the globe, across Southeast Asia, on innovative solutions and initiatives to collectively seek and reduce the environmental of healthcare delivery. In this instance, environmental health and climate change are two connected issues that are impacting on health. And therefore, we want to elevate the voice of the sector on the health impacts of climate change and air pollution. Now, a very recent incident, and for which we are still dealing with in the Philippines, is the oil spill in Mindoro. Now, recently, as the cleanup goes on, there are already reports coming from communities and the affected population of reports about experiences of nausea, headaches, and other ill effects of that oil spill. To the most common, ordinary fisher folks, their families, that had nothing to do with that barge of oil that spilled onto their waters. There are also questions of what is the impact of plastic packaging on our own health as we consume the very food that comes out of that plastic package. There's also an established study on the health impact of air pollution, which also directly related to fossil fuel. And therefore, in every time that whether an industry, a policy of the government would propel further change of the climate, whether by providing privileged kind of financial support to the oil industry, or whether it is by minimizing or by not changing and not revisiting the air pollution quality standards in a country, then there's a violation that is ongoing that impacts on health. And this is where we appreciate the work of the young people to bring this to the table and put it onto the table of the ICJ, to which we think this will be very beneficial, even to our own work the moment it happens, and for which we support you fully. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Mon. It's very disheartening hearing and seeing the news lately, especially with what happened in Mindoro. And Asia also commented that it has reached the coast of Palawan. So a lot of people and communities are really affected by this. And I agree, Sir Mon, that the healthcare sector has a huge responsibility in our fight against climate crisis. And I specifically like the line that you said, that the crisis on climate is a crisis on public health, and vice versa, of course. We see how plastic pollution, fossil fuel extraction, or even oil spills that happen in Mindoro, and POPs, or toxic chemicals, negatively impacts public health, especially of the marginal sector, children, women, and like the agriculture sector. So, Thermon, as a healthcare advocate, how do you think this ICJ advisory opinion can support your work here in Asia?
Towards the end of last year, Healthcare Without Harm released a document on how we view the whole question of just transition. As we now advocate for the big emitters to begin seeing their own guilt and their own responsibility and accountability with all the adverse impact of global warming, particularly to countries like the Philippines. Now, in that just transition, we would want to bring about we aim to bring about a social, environmentally responsible change as a transitioning to low carbon economy. That would mean as well impacting workers and communities that may be adversely affected by by the transition, ensuring that they have the necessary resources and support to adapt to these changes. It would provide us a better handle, whether it is a legal or moral or that human right angle, to begin asking hard questions. And this we do in a lot of ways in our own battle with the on plastics. We don't view plastics as an issue alone of disposal, of simply making better our waste management system, whether in the hospitals or in the community. We think that the whole issue of plastic is a question of production and a question that is right in front of the gates of the big companies that are earning big money out of simply dispensing whatever products in small plastic packages, yung mga what we call as tingi-tingi. So if at all we will be able to gain a huge or small victory over these various struggles that all would point out to the responsibility of the industry on fossil fuel extraction, that's where the just transition do come in. And if we have this handle of a legal acknowledgement that there is someone has to pay for all the human rights violation in that human-induced climate change that is taking place quick and really felt by communities, just like the oil spill that we're talking about in the past days, then we appreciate ICJ making that opinion favoring communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your dedication to this fight, Chairman. Of course, to the entire Healthcare Without Harm Asia. I'm sure you've inspired everyone here in the Zoom webinar to join the campaign for a socially responsible change towards a low carbon economy, and of course, our push for corporate responsibility, or the polluters pay principle. Thank you so much, Sir Mon, and we'll continue the discussion later at the open forum. Next, to our panelist, Ms. Marleya. We're excited to hear about your insights on this issue, especially coming from the community and indigenous sector experience. Ms. Marleya, there has been significant research on the disproportionate impact of climate change on women and girls. So can you share examples that you've observed from your work, and have any interventions, policies, or programs been made to address these impacts?
Hi, I'd like to start with I'm inspired because we are talking to the youth, and we were once in that stage of our lives. But of course, we are still here not to pass the torch, as I said, but we will continue to light torches for people to walk along with us in this advocacy for the climate and for the peoples. I'd like to focus on basic examples that are anchored on the human rights, social, economic, cultural, civil, and political rights. So what are the impacts that I have seen from the communities where I have been working with or cooperating with, especially with women leaders, IT women leaders? For the social aspect of our rights, aside from the health that was already discussed by Sir Mon, I'd like to add that we have increasing situations of lack of access to education and right information. Why? Why is this related to climate change? Because they are intertwined with these two rights, are intertwined with what they have on the economic side that will enable them to actually access education and right information. The climate has changed the seasons of planting and fishing, and our communities are catching up with methodologies and measures on how to deal with these changes. So if they used to plant at a particular time, just like what happened to the onions issue, right? So there was a delay because of the changes in the seasons. And apart from that, there are activities that are happening promoted by government. For instance, there are communities in Palawan, for example, that are subjected to mining operations. Um, when you have your ancestral domain being operated on by mining companies, by they they collect certain mineral resources. They promise not to touch the rest of the resource, but of course that's not true. They cut the trees and they water the soil. So what happens? The topsoil, which is actually very thin, where our indigenous communities are dependent on, are actually flushed down to the downstream. So what happens? You have less productivity. If you have less productivity, you have less income. If you have less income, you have less access. So that's how it is related. So the changes in season and aggravated by the responsible giving of permits to companies that are not responsible in addressing their their methodologies or their procedures in doing their projects. So in terms of cultural, uh, some areas have actually been affected, especially the sacred places. So if you have changes in terms of the when the water would come, the level of rain, the level of heat, then the landscape as well is affected. So if the landscape is affected, the way people behave in terms of where they should shift from one place to another would be affected. Again, it's connected to their productivity, it's connected to their time. How much time do they consume? If they move to another place, which is farther than the places they used to go for their economic benefits, then that means they will have lesser time for their families and for their communities. Then if they have lesser time for their families and communities, then their other rights in terms of being able to participate in community activities like decision making, like being part of planning activities in the municipalities would never be given opportunities because they are out in the field. How can they go to municipalities or in city halls for land use planning if they're out in the field? How can they be consulted for investment planning if they're out in the field? Okay, so that's part of their civil and political rights as well. They cannot be and they will never be heard or listened to. In terms of impact on, I would like to add on the social aspect because the women leaders and the young women in the communities are wanting of enabling conditions and enabling measures for them to actually lead. Why? Because most of the communities are led by men. I have nothing against men, but the training or the capacity building are focused only to men. So what happens when there are changes in seasons that I mentioned? People will move from one area of activity to another. The sharing of activities will be affected. The women will be left to activities that they're not used to, they are not trained to, and the men will be out there to seek for other sources of living or income. So there will be a gap in terms of economic situations of their families and then their communities. So the relationships will also be affected because as they said, love is not enough. When economic issues come into the family situations, love goes out of the window. But that's just to simplify things. The biggest situation or the biggest problem that we have now for young women and women leaders in the communities, they are not given the opportunities equitably to lead, to address what's happening in their respective land or ancestral domains, to actually have a say in land allocation and land uses, because the changing climate would require them to also move from one traditional way of doing things to another. And they are not able to do that. There are no enabling conditions.
That's very well said, Miss Marleya. I felt it, and it's nice to hear stories from the ground how climate change really is a human rights issue. So, Miss Marleya, how could the ICJ advisory opinion on climate change and human rights support the women and girls in the indigenous and local communities that you have worked with?
First, I'd like to state that instead of the government to provide interventions for young women and women leaders to be capacitated to lead and make changes or make significant contributions to their communities, the government is actually leading some projects that are giving more burden to young women and our women leaders. Therefore, if we have an advisory opinion from ICJ that will connect, as simply as I've said, the human rights and climate change, and will make sure, or I will not make sure, but will in fact encourage or urge our government to go by the law on indigenous people's rights. I think this is the only human rights law that we have directly for indigenous peoples, and yet it's not being followed in a sense to be biased for them, but it's being used to actually suppress them. So the Philippine Commission on Human Rights can be part of the core team. I should call them a core team to make sure that the Philippine Commission on Women, the National Youth Commission, the Center or the Council for the Welfare of Children will come together. They're all under the office of the president, except for the Commission on Human Rights. And then they get advice, the technical advice from the DENR, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, from the Department of Agriculture, and then operationally, they work with the local government units. I don't know if that's difficult. It's not difficult. It's a matter of people really knowing what they do, right? The communities, the IPs have their ancestral domain sustainable development plan, protection development plan. If they don't have those, then the government should have them come up with a plan instead of pressuring them to accept projects that are not consistent with their vision. I don't think there is a cultural community that has a vision that the forest in their ancestral domains will be replaced by a mining operation. But since the government has delegated the basic services to these companies like education, food, and all that, then they have no choice. But what if the government should really do their job? You don't need those companies to provide for education. You don't need those companies for the roads. You don't need those companies for the seas, right? So let's do our job. And I'm really inspired because I saw Attorney Oposa, the father of Mandanas. I think we should remind the government that the government is just the agent of the state. The state is the government, the people, and our territory. Let's work around that. Let them work for the people, especially for the young women and for the women in the communities. This is a cliche, but I think this is still true. If you work with women, they bring along their families, they bring along their communities, positive change will happen. That's all.
Thank you so much, Miss Marleya. And again, happy Women's Month to you and everyone in this webinar, in Zoom webinar. It's true that in 2023, the government, local and international governments should do their work and they should do better. Local communities, especially indigenous communities, have been exhausting all means to protect the environment. And all stakeholders should step up and do their job, especially those with most power and with most resources. Again, thank you so much, Ms. Marleya. We will have an open forum later. Actually, for the audience who are tuned in now, We have a question and answer box that you can put in your questions. So later, after the panel discussion, we can our panelists can address and respond to your questions. So last in our panelist is Dr. Lavinia. I'm sure a lot of people here already know Dr. Lavinia. Dr. Lavinia, we believe that you are teaching environmental law in various law schools here in the country. Do you think that environmental law and policy in Southeast Asia adequately recognizes climate change as a human rights issue? Are there any new developments or efforts in the laws and policies in the region that can strengthen the climate change human rights nexus?
There's still a lot of work to do. Obviously, it's better than when I started doing this 30 years ago. One of the first teach environmental law in several schools in the Philippines and part of a cohort of
Dr. Lavinia?
Southeast Asian lawyers that began special law. It's a challenge in Southeast Asia of our governments or authoritarian. So there, can you hear me? Sorry, am I lagging?
Yes, okay na pa.
Sige.
All right.
But we're getting progress because in our region and in Asia in general, we have been at the international level pushing climate justice and the human rights link. And so we're able to show that domestically, we have to do the same thing. In the Philippines, it's easier because we have at least a legal culture that recognizes human rights, recognizes indigenous people's rights, recognizes people participation in environmental law. And so when we teach environmental law, we do emphasize the fact that this is not about nature alone or about the atmosphere alone, but above all, this is about people, and that it's a justice issue. My own work, myself, nowadays, I have been focusing on the ground work in Mindanao with indigenous peoples. I got involved with defending the Lumad schools in UP, in Cebu, and in Davao that the Duterte government tried to close down. And in the process of pushing back and defending them, I realized that this is a climate justice issue. The Lumad schools were created by communities because their old schools were destroyed by climate events. And the struggle or the issues they're faced with, the development aggression issues they're faced with, are all also pose threats to climate. And so, both the forest programs that they have to, or the forest activities they have to fight, or the extractive industries that are being pushed on them. So the explicit connection between climate, environment, and human rights is very obvious in the Philippines, and I would say also in this region in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Myanmar, in Cambodia, and so that way, at least in the universities, there is a recognition that human rights law and environmental law are intimately intertwined.
And Dr. Levine, why do you think an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice is crucial in creating the legal nexus between climate change and human rights? How will its non-binding nature affect its potential influence on laws and policies?
That's a good question. And the first thing first, it doesn't matter whether it's binding or non-binding at this stage, because we are still, in terms of international law, the foundational stage, especially in jurisprudence. We don't have a much of international jurisprudence. We have country jurisprudence already in several countries, but we don't have the international jurisprudence. An advisory opinion is the first step that you do that. The most famous advisory opinion in the last, let's say, 40 years was in the case of U.S. versus Nicaragua, which the U.S. lost and the Nicaraguans won. That did not stop the U.S. from, sabotaging the Nicaraguan revolution, but it gave the Nicaraguans, in their foreign policy and their engagement with other countries, sure footing that they were in the right place. So an advisory opinion would have that effect of basically telling developing countries, the youth in the most vulnerable countries like in island states, that the world recognizes that legally you have this right, and therefore you have to act as if you have this right, and then seek to change the behavior of the bigger actors that do not recognize this right. And believe it or not, eventually they come around. I'll give you an example, Pat. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was negotiated for a while in the UN. And it was finally adopted. Some of the biggest countries in the world, the United States, Canada, a few other countries actually refuse. Our colleagues in Indonesia, a good example, I worked with a lot of them through the years. In the early years, they wouldn't recognize indigenous peoples' rights. They would actually say there are no indigenous peoples in Indonesia, which of course is factually not true, anthropologically not true. But all that has changed in the last 20 years. When advisory opinions, when declarations are done, no? These are all soft law. These are not binding law. But as I teach this subject in several schools this semester alone, 2 or 3 schools, and 2 in Mindanao, 1 here in Manila. And I teach public international, and we actually take up this advisory opinion and how should it be decided. And it's very clear that the liability based on environmental and human rights grounds, developed countries and other countries that continue to behave as if there was no climate crisis is very obvious and self-evident, actually.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lavinia, for sharing your decades worth of insights and experience in international and national law. And of course, you're truly an inspiration to us all here from the panelists and of course the audience. It's true that we have a lot of things to do, and I'm sure we from the youth sector is ready to take on the challenge. We've heard from the previous panelists about the challenges and experience from the ground. So it's really great to hear positive news at the very least that there have been great strides in the movement in the legal aspects, especially with the passing of the UN DRIP and even the UN DROP in 2018, which was also, I believe, campaigned by organizations in Indonesia. Thank you so much, Dean Toad. So that ends our panel discussion, but we still have an open forum where we can ask questions and all of the panelists can address the questions from the audience. Time truly flies fast when you are enjoying what you're doing. So for sure, our audience also enjoyed listening to the different perspectives and approaches of our panelists to climate change and human rights, that they are already burning with questions and not fossil fuels. The floor is now open to questions from esteemed speakers. So again, if you have questions, you can raise your virtual hand, and organizers will acknowledge you. And I believe you can turn on your speakers and ask your questions directly to our panelists. Or if you're feeling shy, or if you can't turn on your videos, you can also drop in your questions in the question and answer box. And I can read your questions out loud. So are there? I'm sorry, I don't see the audience. So if anyone is, organizers, just let me know if anyone is raising their hand. But actually, someone already sent in some of their questions through private message in our Zoom. So maybe I'll read it first if anyone is still like needs time to think of their question. So to anyone in the panelists, the first question from the audience is, what are the implications of an ICG's AO to South Asian countries most vulnerable to climate change negotiation position in loss and damage? I think I need to say it again. It's quite wordy. So what are the implications of an ICG's AO to Southeast Asian countries most vulnerable to climate change negotiation position in loss and damage? So anyone from the panelists, if anyone wants to answer it?
See, I can start.
Yeah, Attorney Asia.
Okay. I'll give the Philippines as an example, no, since we're very vulnerable also. The advisory opinion, like I said earlier, will be a tool, and advocates and people on the ground can use it to lobby with their governments to do certain things. Like, for example, since there's a clear, if it gets answered the way we want it to, if there's a clear obligation between the state to protect its citizen in light of the climate crisis, then maybe it will be a tool for us to lobby with our government to more proactively negotiate or lobby in the international scene. Because the past how many years, the Philippines is not very, it's not at its best when it comes to international negotiations on climate change. So that's my brief answer to that.
Thank you, Attorney Asia. I believe you were able to answer that perfectly and concisely. Anyone from the panelists would like to add? There are actually 2 more questions privately sent to us from the audience. This is the next question is also in line with the first question. Anyone from the panel, what do you think the ICJ should carefully consider in its crafting of an advisory opinion of the obligations of states in respect of climate change? So I guess, yes, Sermon.
Yeah, let me go back to the earlier question.
All right.
Because right after the very good development on loss and damage fund in the last COP, health NGOs came out with a statement that says in part that limiting warning to 1.5 degrees is essential to avert catastrophic health impacts of climate change, but still it will require phasing out all fossil fuels. And therefore, only full fossil fuel phase out will deliver the maximum health benefits from clean air and clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And even if we welcome the loss and damage fund, the real path to delivering relief to countries bearing the brunt of climate crisis is to phase out fossil fuel.
I agree, Sermon. Loss and damage is one crucial aspect to our fight against climate change and, of course, climate justice. But at the end of the day, if you really want to stop the issue, is to go from the very source, which is to stop fossil fuel. Absolutely stop fossil fuel. Thank you, Sermon, for that answer. And on the second question that I said earlier, I feel like it would be a good it would be good for Ms. Marleya coming from the IT and women's sector to answer it, of what you think the ICJ should carefully consider in its crafting of an advisory opinion of the obligations of state in respect of climate change, maybe coming from more of the social and cultural aspect that should be added to it.
Yeah. First, I think we should take note that the Philippines is not part of that resolution asking for the ICJ advisory opinion. So, and the current trade condition of the Philippines is that the government is not so keen about engaging on UN related changes in its policies and programs. So that's our context. So therefore, the ICJ should consider that particular unique situation of the Philippines. Aside from the fact that it should stop the positive thing of having ICRA, of having Magna Carta of Women, of having the responsible mining in the mining industry, looking at the free and prior informed consent process and processes, because this has developed into various forms that I could no longer recognize. So they should come as a tool, but beyond that, as practical as possible, that can be understood and can be practically used. How? If that document comes to me as a trainer, and if it is so easy for me to explain that to the community can actually make that as a reference in their community resolutions, it will pass the test of being simple and being um, significantly contributing to what they're doing in the communities. If not, then it will just be up in the air. So it will my message is that it can only be useful if it is understood, it is practical, and it can be um, used under the current frame conditions of the Philippines. Because we cannot wait. We cannot wait. Right.
I agree, Miss Marleya, that we shouldn't forget why who we're doing this for, the very people we're doing this for. And Attorney Asia also mentioned this earlier, that these negotiations and papers can be very daunting and highfalutin to people. So it's very important that the advisories and everything that we write and make are still relevant and understandable to the very people we are doing this for. Thank you so much, Miss Marleya. And for the last question, maybe to Dr. Lavinia. Do you foresee any challenges at this point in successfully campaigning to request the ICJ for an advisory opinion?
Right now, there doesn't seem to be any major challenge other than sort of legal or doctrinal in nature. There doesn't seem to be a strong political challenge, for example. So this should be doable. I think we should prepare for a time when the ICJ will actually call for hearings and hear people give the theory for why certain rulings, certain doctrines can be laid down here to guide people. So the challenge here is really more whether the ICJ see the utility of an advisory opinion, and I think that's a case that should be easy to make. We tend sometimes to when we work in this area, we tend to be impatient, tend to be frustrated, and there's a reason for that. On the other hand, just this few months, we made a very big step internationally, negotiating a new treaty on on marine biodiversity in the high seas. No, I've been following that. If you asked me 10 years ago, I would say impossible, impossible. But look, they agreed on a treaty, including the United States agreed on a treaty, and of course, different ratification has to be done. So those who say that international law is dead, international law in the environment is dead, well, I would say, as both a practitioner, an advocate, and also a teacher, that you're actually wrong. And there's a lot of things that we can still do to move forward. Thank you.
All right, sorry, I was on mute. Thank you so much, Dr. Lavinia. Indeed, international law and environmental law are very much alive and are making great contributions to our fight against climate change. That's the end of our open forum. Thank you so much to our esteemed panels for your valuable insights on the importance of the ICJ advisory opinion on climate change and human rights, and the remarkable role of the youth in this campaign. Once again, thank you so much to all of our panelists and Matthew for your opening message earlier. All right. To formally end the program, I would like to call on Attorney Alaya De Leon to give us the closing remarks.
Okay. Hi, thank you, Pat, for the introduction, and I echo the gratitude that has been expressed for our speaker and our panelists. It's been very inspiring, very educational, and also a really good mix of insights and points of view that really round out our understanding of the issue of the importance of the ICJ advisory opinion in various levels and various contexts. And we really thank our panel, Asia, Sir Mon, Marleya, and Dean Tony, and also, of course, our very active audience for taking the time and joining us in our efforts in anticipation and in support of the UN General Assembly's vote requesting the advisory opinion on climate change from the ICJ. So we're very optimistic and hopeful that this will push through. Just to quickly, we are almost at time, but I think I can try to run through some of the synthesis points, which it's been a very, very rich discussion, but I'll try my best to pick out some of the highlights. We've heard from our speakers that it is really an extraordinary time when the world's youth are taking the lead in these efforts to ensure climate justice. We have all felt their energy and their passion, and they are an inspiration to, they are really an inspiration to all of us, and especially I just want to also give a quick shout out to the team from Parabukas and also our other youth colleagues from ARIEl that have really worked to make this whole webinar and this panel discussion possible. We are no longer youth. We used to be youth, and now we have more and more younger people are joining the cause, and we are so inspired and energized by their active participation and engagement and leadership, of course. And we have seen how the youth bring a lot to the table with their creative approaches and technological know-how. I think it's really important. We also heard that the climate crisis is linked to many other crises in social justice and human rights. Many of these issues are very clearly interlinked. We heard many clear, concrete examples from Sir Mon and Marleya on the interconnection between the drivers of climate change and how these impact social, economic, and cultural rights, impact health, safe food, livelihoods, land tenure, and the practice of traditions. So the intersectionality of all these issues with climate change and rights is very, very clear, very, very stark. And we have many people working on these issues, but there's no question that we have to address these issues in an interlinked and interconnected way. The speakers also emphasized that women must be given opportunities to participate in all efforts across the board, policies, programs, and other interventions to address climate change and more broadly, ensure sustainable and equitable land and natural resource use and management. And of course, we always acknowledge the importance of the role of women, even more so this month, today and this month, where we are celebrating Women's Month. And coming to the ICJ advisory opinion and why it is important. Why are we honing in on the advisory opinion? In this webinar and in many other initiatives of the World's Youth for Climate Justice, for example, our speakers have pointed out that the advisory opinion is relevant to communities across Southeast Asia because it can be used as a basis to demand more accountability from governments, particularly mandated agencies, and also the private sector. And as a tool, I think we heard that term used a few times, it can be a tool to advocate, to empower stakeholders on the ground, and also as an advocacy tool for just transition, for example, so that climate solutions leave no one behind. It can also frame hard questions around how many of today's crises are interconnected and who should be held accountable. So the word accountability really is one of the most important aspects of this advisory opinion. And of course, the clear obligation of countries that we want to see come out of this opinion can be used by advocates to lobby more effectively. And we heard from Dean Tony that even if it is not binding, the advisory opinion, it will still be a valuable basis for international jurisprudence to develop and for behavior from bigger actors for change. So even if it is not something legally binding in the, let's say, traditional sense, it is still very persuasive and can still motivate changes in bigger actors, such as the carbon majors, and also as a basis for international jurisprudence. And just to the some points from the open forum, what are the important points for the ICJ to consider? Sir Mon pointed out the importance really of phasing out all fossil fuels, that this really is non-negotiable if we want to achieve our 1.5 degree target of limiting global warming and achieving climate, health, and sustainability goals, and also to fully realize the potential of the movement around loss and damage today or recently. Without this phasing out of all fossil fuels, these other goals will really not be fully achieved. And we also heard from Marleya that the ICJ should approach this opinion in the most practical and accessible way that can be understood not only by countries, but also by communities. Only if it is understood and can be explained and used that it will really be an effective tool and effective advocacy instrument at the national and local levels. And lastly, on the challenges that we might anticipate or encounter, we heard from Dean Tony that any challenges may be legal and doctrinal in nature, but in terms of the politics, there doesn't seem to be any strong political challenge. So he leaves us with a very optimistic message, I think, optimistic tone that it should be doable to have this opinion. And in terms of the utility of the opinion, the ICJ is also likely to find the utility in issuing this opinion. And in terms of what we can do in the meantime, stakeholders, advocates, we need to be prepared for when the ICJ calls for hearings, meaning we also have to be able to present the facts, present the evidence, so that there will be no question about what the findings should be in terms of obligations and accountability of those who are causing the continued warming of the planet. and also that international environmental law still has a big role to play in moving things forward. So I hope that does justice to the many, many important and unique points made. And thank you again to our speakers. I will turn it back to Pat for the final message. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aya, for synthesizing all our takeaways from this session. And it was really a lot. It was a long discussion. At this point, on behalf of Parabukas, the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law, and the World's Youth for Climate Justice, we would like to thank our speakers, Mr. Matthew Baird, and our panelists, Attorney H.O.E., Ms. Marlea Muñez, Mr. Ramon San Pascual, and Dr. Tony Lavinia for joining us and imparting valuable lessons to us. We would also like to thank you, our audience, who took the time to listen and participate in our session. Again, thank you, everyone, and have a good day ahead.